Hello, everybody, and it's good to be back with you on this Thursday. I'd been on vacation last week and really had a great vacation. I was able to help my dad with a lot of projects he had in a house that he's getting ready to move into. They're downsizing to a smaller home, and so I was able to help him with some flooring and some painting, and we had a good time together. And then I was able to see my grandsons for a couple of days also, and that's always fun. And of course, we had a couple of days of rest and relaxation in there also. Overall, it was a really, really good vacation, and I really enjoyed myself. Now, getting back to our study in the Gospel of Matthew. Today, I want to look at Matthew 10. And so before you start reading it, I want to look at Matthew 10, 1 through 15. There's not any way that we can get through the whole chapter in a reasonable amount of time, so we're just going to look at the first 15 verses. We will probably have to split this chapter up into 3 different sections just to get through it in a timely manner, but it's fine. It won't be a problem. But Matthew 10 is our second teaching discourse in the Gospel of Matthew. Now, I know this because these teaching discourses, except for this one, there's only part of it's true, but these teaching discourses that run through the Gospel of Matthew have a formula that introduces them and closes them. So the formula to introduce is something to the effect of when Jesus began to teach, something like that. So it's the idea of beginning to do something. Teaching, speaking, something to that effect. And then they'll close out and they'll say when Jesus finished, basically speaking whatever it was he was doing, or instructing, or teaching, or it could be speaking parables. The only difference in this one is that in chapter 10 we do not have that introductory formula. However, we do have the closing formula in the beginning of chapter 11. So, everyone is in agreement as far as scholarship that Matthew 10 is the second teaching discourse in the Gospel of Matthew, and it is a discourse about mission. So go ahead and stop the video right now and just read Matthew 10, 1 through 15. And then as soon as you're done, go ahead and start the video back up. Okay, I'll assume that you have read this. Now, Matthew 10 is an early mission discourse in the Gospel of Matthew. It kind of sets up things for us in regard to at the very end of the Gospel of Matthew. We all know about the Great Commission in Matthew 28 when Jesus tells the disciples that, going and make disciples and baptize and teaching and so forth and so on. That comes at the very end of chapter 28, and at that point it's for all nations, all peoples. Here in Matthew 10, it's a smaller version. In fact, it is restricted. Jesus restricts his disciples just to the lost sheep of Israel. So it's much different. And another thing about Matthew 10, we have not, Jesus has not, I should say, achieved the outcome of the gospel salvation plan. So he still has to achieve all that, and he will, we know, but he has not achieved it at this point, and so he must be talking about something much different. He has to be talking about old covenantal standards, and that's not a crazy idea, because if you look in the Sermon on the Mount, the first teaching discourse, Matthew 5, 6, and 7, it's all about the instructions of the Old Covenant. Jesus just tells them they are not doing it the right way. And so basically they've abused the intent of the guidelines and have repurposed them in many ways to suit their own needs and wants. And that's exactly what happened a lot of times. And it was one of the main problems with Judaism in the time of Jesus' time. Now, so Jesus restricts the disciples. You see at the very beginning of this, I'm skipping ahead just a little bit, but let me talk about the listing of the disciples real quick, and then we'll come back to some of this. So, we have Jesus giving these disciples, and this is where it's called the 12 disciples. This is the very first point in the Gospel of Matthew where the 12 are identified. The list will not appear again, but we'll have the number 12 showing up later on. And so we'll see like the 12, Jesus speaking to the 12, or Judas, one of the 12, that kind of idea. So we do have the number 12 that's designated for this group, however, but we don't have the listing. Now, Jesus gave them authority, and it tells us what he was the authority over in verse 1. He gave them authority to exorcise demons. Now, let me talk about that just for a moment. Jesus has been exorcising demons. In fact, he's done several of them before this in chapters 8 and 9. But if you remember going back to chapter 4, this is really important in the Gospel of Matthew, that Jesus is able to overcome the temptations of Satan. And by doing so, he does not succumb to the authority or the desire for authority, I guess I should say, that Satan wants to have over him. And so Jesus achieves this authority over Satan at that time because he does not succumb to his temptations. Now, because he has mastered the master of the demonic hordes, Satan, he is able to have authority over demons, and Jesus exorcises many demons. And now he gives this authority to his disciples. So he just gives it to them to exercise them. And he also gives them the ability to heal. And so they can go out and do the healings like what Jesus has done. And so Jesus gives all this authority to them. Now, these ministry objectives, there's only one in here that is not associated with some of the ministry activities of Jesus, and that is proclaiming the kingdom of heaven. However, you look down farther into the discourse, and it's in verse 7, he tells them to go out and proclaim that the kingdom of heaven has come near. So that part of the ministry objectives of Jesus is also addressed. It just comes much later. I bring this up because of this. These ministry objectives, or these abilities that Jesus has given, these authorities to do these things that Jesus has given these disciples, they fit right into the objectives of Jesus' ministry. Remember in chapter 4 and in chapter 9 we had this repetitive phrasing going on. It was 4:23 and 9:35. This repetitive phrasing about Jesus going out into the villages and the synagogues and proclaiming the kingdom of heaven and healing all kinds of diseases and ailments and casting out demons. Now that's a paraphrase, but the same objectives that Jesus has performed or has been involved in, they will be involved in also at this point. Now, in verse 12, they are called the apostles. So this is the first time they're called apostles. Now, we make a big deal out of the word apostle, but it's just a very general word. In fact, it derives from a verbal form, and it just means to one who's sent. It means to send. That's all it does, to send away, actually. And so that's all it has. It's very general here, and it fits with what Jesus is doing. He's called his disciples, and guess what? He's sending them away. So what are they? The sent away ones, or the apostolos. Okay, and so that's what they are. Now, the naming, the name. So one of the things that's odd about the listing of the disciples, it doesn't matter what gospel you look at, is that they never are the same. And so if you looked in the Gospel of Mark, this listing would be a little bit different. If you looked in the Gospel of Luke, this listing would be a little bit different. If you looked in the Gospel of John, it's going to be a little bit different. There are some that are standard names that show up in all the lists. So for instance, Peter and Andrew, James and John, Matthew, Philip, and Judas, because he's the one who betrayed. They show up in every listing. Now some of the others show up here and there, not always. Maybe there might be a name change here and there, which really I don't think is much of a problem. I think it's highly likely, we don't know for sure, it's highly likely that some of these other names that appear, like Nathaniel, that show up in the Gospel of John, maybe are nicknames for someone. In fact, Nathaniel would definitely be a Hebrew name. It would mean God is my gift, or something like that. It's a gifting, something from God, that kind of idea. But anyway, they're not the same except for those few that they're there. And again, I wouldn't get too bothered by that. It's just not that big of a deal. But however, there are some things that are notable in the listing. Peter tells us his real name, Simon. It's very interesting is that Jesus gives Simon the name Peter. Apostle Paul never uses it. He never calls him that. He always calls him Cephas. And then another thing is it Matthew's here, but he's always called the tax collector, to show, I guess, that some people might think that Jesus is running around with a sordid crowd. However, Jesus never turned away tax collectors and sinners, he says. So Judas is always there in the list, and it's always he's always identified as the betrayer. So many of them, as I said, show up in many of the lists, but they're not always there across the board. Now, he tells them, starting in verse 5, Jesus tells them, don't go to the non-Jewish people. And you're scratching your head, well, why would they not go to the non-Jewish people? Or even to the Samaritans? Because Samaritans are really akin to the Jewish people. In fact, they both would have followed the Old Covenant guidelines. The Samaritans did it it wasn't their own way, but they did it in their own place. They had the Pentateuch just like the Jewish people did. Theirs is called the Samaritan Pentateuch. And so they followed the same covenant. But anyway, Jesus restricts his disciples and tells them not to go among the non-Jews. Now, later on, chapter 28, this will not be, he'll send his disciples out to all groups. But right now, he restricts them. He tells them to go out and do this. And I want to talk about the kingdom of heaven is at hand. This is an important phrase, I think. It's an important phrase in the objectives of Jesus' ministry. Because it tells me, and actually the Greek says that the kingdom of heaven has come near. So something has happened in the past, has some kind of effect into the present. It's a perfect tense verb in the Greek. And so you can think about the ministry of Jesus. I mean, he's talking about the kingdom of heaven. He embodies the kingdom of heaven, has come into this world. All right? And it is near to people. All they need to do is accept it. If they accept him, they're accepting the kingdom of heaven. This is the kind of idea. So go out and teach people about this kingdom of heaven. Prepare people for the coming of the new covenant is what the idea is. However, he has got to talk to people about the old covenant also until he achieves the purposes of the new covenant. He tells them not to take any gifts. One thing about this, the lost sheep of the house of Israel. Let me talk about that really quick. It's just a slang way of talking about Jewish people. Israel, the idea of Israel is long gone at this time. In fact, the Assyrians and the Babylonians have basically decimated the Israelites that we know of that came out of the Egyptian Exodus. And all you have left is the tribe of Judah. That's why they're called Jews. It was a shortened form for Judahites. And so we no longer have the house of Israel. Basically all you have is the house of Judah and a few scattered elements of some tribes, and that's about it. So it's not the lost sheep of Israel. This is just a historically polite way, I guess, to talk about this ministry objective as far as geography and ethnicity. But anyway, go out and tell people that what is going on. And there's also going to be these miracles that go with it. Okay? And so the people hopefully will become convinced by what they are doing. Now he tells them not to accept any gifts or money. Nothing like that. Don't take anything for what you're doing. You might think, like, why? Why would that be so? Well, in that day, in fact, people still do it today in some places. I know they do. People would go out and they would try to convince people that they had this divine power and that they could use it to help people out. And if so, they wanted money. It happened all the time from all these mystery religions. There was all kinds of traveling philosophers in that time. They would bring and try to convince people of their, for lack of a better term or phrase, religious system, and they would want money for it. Well, Jesus says, no, you're not going to be like that. You're going to go out and you're going to take nothing with you. You're going to trust in God. That's what he says. Don't take any money and don't take anything with you. You are going to have to trust in God. Now, it doesn't tell us how it goes, but I'm sure it goes very, very fine. It's much different than the Gospel of Luke, where after this sending out of these disciples, they come back and telling Jesus all that they've done, and Jesus rejoices with them about their successful ministries. It's not that way in the Gospel of Matthew. However, we can assume, since there was not any negative here, that everything went fine for those people. Now, if they go somewhere and they're not welcomed, they are to, says, take their peace with them. If they're accepted, then they give this peace. Now, what is this idea of peace? It has to be some kind of an idea of a divine blessing. And it has to go back to like the prophet Elijah, for instance. So the prophet Elijah was told to go and live at the widow's house, and while the prophet was there, there was a blessing on that house. The food didn't run out. In fact, the lady's son died, and Elijah resurrects him from the dead. And so there was this blessing that was associated with Elijah the prophet stay in that house. And I think that's kind of what's going on here. If the people accept you and have practiced hospitality, then that divine blessing goes with you into that house. Here's something very interesting. We often talk about, I'm going to skip to Hebrews, just an idea from Hebrews real quick, just sidetrack just for a moment. Hebrews 13, I believe, there's this point, there's a statement in Hebrews 13 that there were angels have come and people have ministered to angels without even knowing it, that kind of idea. And we automatically think of spiritual beings. However, the word angels, we need to understand in Greek, is just a general term for messenger. Just a messenger. I actually think what's going on in Matthew 10 may be explanatory for what he's talking about in Hebrews. Now, even though they're two different writers, still in the Christian community, in a small Christian community in the first century. In Matthew 10, these are people that are sent. These are messengers. Even though they're not called angelos, but they are. What they do is they're a messenger. They're taking a message out. They're proclaiming the kingdom of heaven is near. They're taking a message. And so this is what he's talking about. He's talking about practicing hospitality. In Hebrews 13, he's probably talking about physical visitors also, or human visitors, not these spiritual angels that we just automatically assume. We automatically read a Genesis 19 account into that with Abraham welcoming the angel of the Lord. Actually, it was the Lord and two other beings. But we ought to look to the New Testament sometimes to see if there's any kind of explanation that might arise for some of these passages. And Matthew 10 may be a very good explanation for that peculiar text in Hebrews 13. Matthew 10 is also going to be very informative for us, as I said before, when we get to Matthew 25, 31 through 46. If I haven't said it, I'll say it now, and I'll say it again probably, but this is going to be key for us to understand what's going on in this parable of the sheep and the goats. Well, some of this information that comes out of chapter 10 is going to help us to understand what's going on in that passage. Okay, now, as I said, if the house does not welcome the person, then the blessing does not stay. It goes with them. All right? And acceptance of the messenger is acceptance of God himself, or the acceptance of Jesus, and rejection of it is rejection of Jesus. So this is very, very important, and it's a condemning message. If you look at the very end, people who reject Jesus, there comes condemnation. Ultimately. And so, likened to Sodom and Gomorrah, which we know from the Old Testament stories, Genesis 19, that these cities were destroyed for wickedness. You can look in Ezekiel 28 too. It talks about their destruction in Ezekiel 28 too. All right, I'm going to stop right there. And so, a couple things I just want to bring back up is that Matthew 10 is a preemptive discourse on mission. It helps us to understand what is wanted in chapter 28 when he talks about going and making disciples. And in 28 we have this expansion. No longer has it been restricted just to the Jewish people. Now it's been expanded to all people. And then also some of the information that we receive as we keep on going in Matthew 10 is going to be very helpful for us in Matthew 25, 31 through 46. So please remember some of this information. All right, I'm going to stop right there, and we'll pick up from there next week. And I look forward to getting back in Matthew with you next Thursday. So I hope you have a great rest of your day and a great weekend, and I'll see you on Sunday.